I know my title suggests I will be talking about peace, and I will. And I know my sermon description suggests that this will be a history sermon, and it will. But really this morning, it's all about integrity and freedom of conscience. Reverend John Haynes Holmes is likely not a well-known figure from our religious history, but his impact has been significant. He was born almost 150 years ago and was an influential pacifist minister during the First and Second World Wars. He served the Community Church of New York City for nearly 4 decades. As I mentioned in my description of this service, Holmes was a staunch pacifist and notably a co-founder of both the NAACP and the ACLU. Yet he was a controversial figure. His relationship with Unitarianism and with his colleagues was tumultuous. We effectively pushed him out of Unitarianism for being a nonconformist in his pacifism, which is wild. I want to share with you the story of how our Unitarianism got caught up in the fervor of supporting the war and nearly lost our moral center as a tradition. On both the Unitarian and Universalist sides of our heritage, we have prided ourselves on our commitment to freedom of belief and freedom of conscience. I have several times preached about the foundational value of honoring our theological diversity, of allowing our variety among our beliefs together, of insisting that we do not exclude based on such differences. Freedom of belief and freedom of conscience are central to our way of faith. Yet we have not always practiced these freedoms well. And my sermon today begins in one of our failures on this count. I need to set the scene. This is 1917, right at the time the United States has joined the war in Europe, the Great War, the war to end all wars, or what we later came to call the First World War. The Unitarians met for their General Conference meeting, and the topic of supporting the war was put forth for discussion and for resolution. The moderator of the conference in 1917 is former President of the United States, William Howard Taft. Taft is the most recent of our 4 Unitarian United States presidents, serving from 1909 to 1913. So this is 4 years later. Taft strongly encouraged the Unitarian Conference to support the war effort. Taft gave an opening address at the conference calling on the clergy to preach the righteousness of the war, to say it is necessary to preserve a peaceful world, and that we ought to all get behind President Wilson. John Haynes Holmes is the young minister of what was then known as Church of the Messiah, New York City, a prominent Unitarian pulpit. Holmes was a strong advocate for justice and the modern social message of religion. He was in a position to bring a report about the perspectives and attitudes of Unitarians toward the war. As a staunch pacifist, he called for the clergy to mourn the dead, to cry out at the destruction, and seek the path of reconciliation. Taft did not like Holmes's report, and setting aside the moderator gavel, took to the floor and argued against Holmes's pacifism and proposed a motion saying that it is the sense of the Unitarian Conference that this war must be carried to a successful issue, that we approve the measures of President Wilson and the Congress to carry on this war. In the debate, according to one of my history books, Holmes rose and said, "I am a pacifist. I am non-resistant. I hate war. I hate this war. So long as I live and breathe, I will have nothing to do with this war or any war. So help me God." And Taft said, Our house is afire and we must put it out. It is no time for considering whether the firemen are using the best kind of water. The motion was adopted by a vote of 236 to 9. There are times in history when we feel a fervent need to take some communal action, to stand against some evil. It is not a stretch to say that many people, myself included, feel we are in just such a moment for our country today. Yet to refuse a space for conscientious dissent feels unimaginable. Everything in me would rebel if there were a resolution from the UUA proclaiming that all of us must agree with this or that policy or proposal or action. In 1918, the year following that debate between Taft and Holmes, the leadership of the American Unitarian Association issued sanctions against congregations employing a minister who was not, quote, a willing, earnest, and outspoken supporter of the United States in the vigorous and resolute prosecution of the war. They withheld all aid to such congregations. Holmes withdrew his fellowship with the Unitarians, and the church likewise left the association, changed its name to Community Church, New York City. A decade or so after that war, the Unitarians struck down those sanctions, and as he neared retirement, Holmes was courted by Unitarian leadership to reinstate his fellowship among the Unitarians, which he did. The broader story includes this reconciliation. In recent years, pro-war UUs are far from the majority. The countercultural movements of the 60s became our bread and butter in the following decades. Peace, civil rights, equality, diversity, these values and their accompanying justice issues became bedrock cultural aspects of our Unitarian Universalist identity. Holmes's ministry predates all of that by a few decades. Over the years, I have bumped into people who assumed Unitarian Universalists were always anti-war. One person was aghast to hear a colleague suggest, "We're not considered one of the peace churches." The peace churches are denominations such as the Brethren, the Quakers, the Amish and Mennonites, who have historically held biblical commitment to non-resistance and pacifism as a core tenet of their faith. I am reminded of James Baldwin's quip, "If one believes in the Prince of Peace, one must stop committing crimes in the name of the Prince of Peace." Unitarians have, in more recent times, shifted to more anti-war stances, more reconciling perspectives. In recent conflicts, for example, the Unitarian Universalist Association has been very supportive of Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression, but was non-committal for several months when talking about the war in Gaza. The UUA has more nuanced and cautious perspectives about such stances, perhaps as a reflection of the experience of Holmes, but I doubt it. I don't think the story of John Haynes Holmes and his pacifism and refusal to toe the line with conformity, I don't think they really take up much space in how we remember our history. It's not a story we tell very loudly among ourselves. I will note that throughout our early history, Unitarians in particular have been in the thick of the establishment of our government. Many of the founding fathers of the United States had some Unitarian connection. We were owners of business and leading academics in the early formation of this nation. We were influencers. We were the establishment. The past 100 years, however, have seen a pivot away from Unitarians holding significant political influence. We have, most notably during the 60s and onward, shifted toward being a voice of resistance. And circling back to Holmes, I would credit his ministry as having an indirect impact on our progress toward that new identity as a religious tradition. I would not say that we've become anti-establishment, though. I think we've grown into a faith community that is not simply against something. We're working for establishing a kind of community that serves the needs of all people through our values. I would also not say that Holmes's greatest attribute was his pacifism. Yes, his stance against the war precipitated his withdrawal from the Unitarian Association, but that particular stance was grounded in a broader vision of what could be when we set militarism aside. In one of his 1917 sermons, he said, "War and democracy are incompatible." He spoke about how the mindset of war tramples the values we're wanting to protect by going to war. While we may not be actively at war today in the way that we were in 1917, it is not hard to see how great an impact militarism has had on the erosion of our democracy. Can you see how the state's use of force has eroded our freedom? It is not this broader vision of what could be. Oh, it is. It is this broader vision of what could be that led me to want to know more about Reverend John Haynes Holmes. It was not just his radical pacifism. His vision of ministry and the nature of religion was also radical at the time. He was far from the only Unitarian minister calling for a modernization of our theology. Indeed, the humanist movement of the 1930s may have been influenced by some of Holmes' writing. The part I found most prescient for our current situation was his call for, quote, a religion that moved from concentration on the individual and focused instead on the social nature of every individual. So our current Unitarian Universalist conversations about collective liberation and beloved community are fed by indigenous perspectives as well as from people like Holmes, who swim counterwise from within the dominant stream of our history. His nonconformity was not simply a one-sided complaint against one specific aspect of evil. Holmes offered a holistic vision of a better world. Witness his fuller story. He was approached by W.E.B. Du Bois to join in the creation of the NAACP, one of about 60 people who are never listed among the founders. Holmes was committed to integration and to the rights of people of color. Later, he was part of forming the American Civil Liberties Union, as I said. In both cases, his name is not at the center. And if you look up the history, for example, of the founding of the NAACP, you will not find his name among the founders because he was not front and center. He was in a supportive role as a partner, as an ally, like what we are wanting to do today. I highlight his nonconformity, his refusal to set aside his conscience, but his ministry cannot be reduced to one issue or one fight against the establishment. He was a builder of new possibilities. In this way, he is a role model to me. He heeded the promptings of the Spirit, lived within his integrity, insisted not that everyone agree with him, but that everyone be free to agree with their own conscience. I've never been what you might call an activist preacher. I can preach a good justice sermon, but my calling has always been to build a certain sort of community where all souls shall grow strong, and together we move toward a more beloved world. Holmes did that too. I see that in many of you. And together, we can bring more peace, more grace, more love each day. And God help us, together, we can make this place beautiful. In a world without end. May it be so. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn. It's in the Teal Hymnal Supplement, number 1026, If Every Woman in the World